I was standing over my 8-year-old daughter's grave when my phone buzzed with the text that would destroy everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. The message was from my business partner, our accountant Mike Chen, and it contained just 7 words that made my blood run cold. Your sister just became majority owner today. While I was saying goodbye to Emily, my own flesh and blood had been systematically dismantling the construction empire my father and I had built together for 16 years. But what Sarah didn't realize was that stealing a construction company isn't like stealing money from a bank account, and I was about to teach her a lesson about the difference between owning something on paper and actually knowing how to run it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The March rain was coming down in sheets that Thursday afternoon, turning the carefully manicured grass at Sunset Memorial Cemetery into a muddy mess that seemed to mirror the state of my heart. I stood there holding Jessica's trembling hand as the priest's words washed over us like white noise, my mind still struggling to accept that my little girl was really gone. Emily had fought leukemia for 2 brutal years, and I had been by her side through every chemotherapy session, every sleepless night in the hospital, every moment of hope followed by crushing disappointment. The construction business that had been my life's work for the past 16 years had taken a backseat to being a father, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. My father Robert stood beside me, his weathered hands clasped tightly in front of him, his usual commanding presence somehow diminished by grief. At 67, he had built Miller Construction from nothing into one of Austin's most respected contracting companies, and I had been proud to carry on that legacy. But today, watching him struggle to find words of comfort for his son who had just lost a granddaughter, he looked every one of his years. Sarah stood on his other side, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the grieving aunt perfectly. I should have paid more attention to how quickly she had appeared at his side, how she had been the one to handle all the funeral arrangements while Jessica and I were too broken to think straight. The service ended with the lowering of a tiny white casket that should never have existed, and I felt something fundamental break inside my chest. As family and friends began to drift away, offering their final condolences and promises to check on us soon, I noticed Sarah speaking quietly with our father near the cemetery's entrance. They were too far away for me to hear their conversation, but something about their body language struck me as odd. Sarah kept glancing back at me while speaking in urgent, hushed tones, and Dad kept nodding with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I started walking toward them, Sarah quickly said something that made Dad pat her shoulder before they separated, him heading to his truck and her walking back toward Jessica and me. "David, I'm so sorry," Sarah said, embracing me with what felt like genuine emotion. "Emily was such a bright light. I can't imagine what you and Jessica are going through right now." Her words sounded sincere, and I was grateful for any comfort in that moment of overwhelming loss. "Dad and I were just talking about giving you and Jessica all the time you need to grieve. Don't worry about the business right now, we'll handle everything until you're ready to come back." At the time, her offer seemed like the kindness of a sister who understood that I needed space to mourn. Looking back, I realize it was the beginning of a calculated takeover that had probably been in motion for months. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors, sympathy cards from Emily's classmates, and the impossible task of learning how to live in a world without my daughter's laughter filling our home. Jessica and I moved through our days like ghosts, barely speaking, both of us lost in our own private grief. I ignored the calls from the construction office, trusting that Rachel Torres, my assistant manager for the past 8 years, would keep things running smoothly with Dad's oversight. Miller Construction had been built on reliability and quality craftsmanship, values that Dad had drilled into me from the day I first picked up a hammer on one of his job sites. The company practically ran itself at this point, with established crews, loyal clients, and systems that had been refined over nearly 4 decades. It was Mike Chen who finally broke through my grief-induced isolation with that devastating text message. Mike had been our company accountant for 12 years, a meticulous man who treated every financial document like a sacred text. When his message appeared on my phone screen, I was sitting in Emily's bedroom, surrounded by her drawings and the little construction hard hat Dad had given her for her 7th birthday. She had always loved visiting the job sites, asking endless questions about how buildings went up and why certain materials were chosen over others. In another world, she might have grown up to join the family business, becoming the 4th generation of Millers to shape Austin's skyline. I stared at Mike's text message for a full minute before its meaning really sank in. "Your sister just became majority owner today." The words didn't make sense. Sarah owned exactly 5% of Miller Construction, a token share Dad had given her years ago when she graduated college, back when we all thought she might eventually join the family business. She had never shown any real interest in construction, choosing instead to pursue marketing degrees and corporate jobs that took her to Dallas and Houston. 8 months ago, she had returned to Austin after being laid off from her latest position, claiming she wanted to be closer to family. Dad had been thrilled to have his little girl back home, and Sarah had been spending increasing amounts of time at his ranch house in Dripping Springs. My hands were shaking as I called Mike back, demanding an explanation that I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "David, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, especially right now." Mike's voice was heavy with regret and disbelief. "But I received notification this morning that there's been a transfer of ownership shares. According to the paperwork I was given, your father has transferred his 60% stake to Sarah, making her the majority owner with 65% total. Your 35% stake remains unchanged, but she now has controlling interest in the company." The phone nearly slipped from my hand as the full implications hit me. "That's impossible, Mike. Dad would never do something like that without talking to me first. We've been partners in this business for 16 years. I've put my blood, sweat, and soul into Miller Construction. There has to be some mistake." But even as I said the words, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Began falling into place. Sarah's frequent visits to Dad's house, the way she had been handling more and more of his personal affairs lately, the subtle comments she had made about Dad seeming forgetful recently. I had attributed his occasional confusion to normal aging and the stress of Emily's illness, but what if there was more to it than that? Mike's voice was careful, professional, but I could hear the concern underneath. "David, I've reviewed all the documentation multiple times. Everything appears to be legally valid, notarized and filed properly. The transfer happened yesterday while you were at the funeral. I wanted to call you immediately, but Sarah specifically instructed me to wait until today. She said she wanted to give you time to grieve before discussing business matters." The calculated cruelty of the timing hit me like a physical blow. While I was burying my daughter, my sister had been executing a plan to steal my life's work. I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence, surrounded by Emily's drawings of construction sites and family pictures that now felt like relics from a different lifetime. Jessica found me there an hour later, still holding my phone, staring at nothing. When I told her what had happened, her reaction was immediate and fierce. "She planned this," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the fog of my shock. "Think about it, David, the timing, the way she's been hovering around your dad lately, the fact that she handled the funeral arrangements. She's been working on this for months, waiting for the right moment when you'd be too devastated to fight back." The more I thought about it, the more Jessica's assessment made sense. Sarah had always been the strategic one in our family, the one who planned 3 moves ahead, while I focused on the immediate task at hand. In school, she had been the debate team captain, the student council president, the one who could convince teachers to change grades and administrators to bend rules. Dad had always been proud of her intelligence and ambition, even when it took her away from the family business. "She's got a good head for business," he would say whenever someone asked why Sarah wasn't involved in Miller Construction. "She's just meant for bigger things than what we do here." But I had been the one who showed up at dawn every morning for 16 years, who knew every crew chief by name, who could look at a building site and spot potential problems before they became expensive disasters. I had been the one who stayed in Austin when Sarah chased opportunities in bigger cities, the one who took care of Dad when his arthritis made climbing scaffolding impossible, the one who held his hand through Mom's cancer diagnosis and death 5 years ago. Miller Construction wasn't just a business to me, it was my identity, my legacy, the foundation of everything I had built with Jessica and Emily. That evening, I drove out to Dad's ranch house in Dripping Springs, my mind racing with questions and accusations I wasn't sure how to voice. The sprawling property had been his refuge since Mom died, a place where he could work with his hands on smaller projects and enjoy the peace of rural living after 4 decades of managing construction crews in the city. I found him in his workshop, meticulously sanding a wooden rocking chair he was building, his movements slow and deliberate. The smell of sawdust and wood stain brought back memories of childhood afternoons spent learning carpentry basics, of Dad teaching me that good craftsmanship was about patience and attention to detail. Dad, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside me. He looked up from his work, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face that might have been guilt or confusion. Mike Chen called me today about some paperwork involving the business. He said there's been a change in ownership structure. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign that this had been a mistake, some kind of misunderstanding that could be easily corrected. Robert set down his sandpaper and wiped his hands on an old rag, avoiding my eyes. David's son, I know this comes as a shock, especially with everything you're dealing with right now. But Sarah convinced me that some changes needed to be made. She's been helping me understand some financial things that I'd been struggling with lately. His voice sounded uncertain, like he was reciting someone else's words rather than expressing his own thoughts. You've been so focused on Emily's treatment, and rightfully so, but the business needed someone to step up and handle the bigger picture. The betrayal in those words cut deeper than I had expected. Dad, I've been handling the bigger picture for 16 years. Yes, I took time to care for my dying daughter, but I never stopped being your partner in this business. Miller Construction is what it is today, because of the work we've done together. How could you transfer ownership to Sarah without even discussing it with me first? My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm, years of suppressed frustration and hurt spilling out in the workshop where Dad had first taught me to use tools. Dad's expression grew more confused, and I could see him struggling to find words. Sarah explained that you might react this way, that you might not understand the necessity of having someone with her education and business background take the lead. She has ideas for expanding the company, for taking it to the next level. You're a good foreman, David, but Sarah has the vision to turn Miller Construction into something really special. The words felt like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to diminish my role and elevate Sarah's supposed superiority. A good foreman, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I'm not just a foreman. I'm your business partner. I'm the one who negotiated the Henderson Plaza contract that brought in $2.3 million last year. I'm the one who developed the safety protocols that got us that insurance rate reduction. I'm the one who built the relationships with the subcontractors and suppliers that keep our costs competitive. The list could have gone on for hours, but I could see from his expression that my words weren't penetrating whatever narrative Sarah had constructed in his mind. Robert shook his head slowly, and I realized with growing horror that he genuinely believed what he was saying. Son, you're emotional right now, and that's understandable. But Sarah has shown me spreadsheets and projections that prove the company needs new leadership. She has a business degree from UT and experience in corporate management. You learned everything you know on job sites, and that's valuable, but it's not enough anymore. The construction industry is changing, becoming more complex, and we need someone who can navigate those changes. As I listened to my father parrot business school buzzwords that sounded nothing like his usual straightforward manner of speaking, I realized that Sarah's manipulation had been even more thorough than I had imagined. She hadn't just convinced him to transfer ownership, she had convinced him that I was inadequate, that my years of dedication and expertise were somehow less valuable than her theoretical knowledge and corporate experience. The man who had once told me that I had the best instincts for construction he had ever seen, was now questioning my ability to contribute meaningfully to the family business. I left Dad's ranch that night feeling more alone than I had since Emily's diagnosis. The drive back to Cedar Park gave me time to process the full scope of what had happened, and by the time I reached home, my grief had transformed into something harder and more focused. Jessica was waiting up for me, and one look at my face told her everything she needed to know. She got to him completely, I said, slumping into the kitchen chair where Emily used to do her homework while I reviewed construction plans. He genuinely believes that I'm not qualified to run the business we built together. Jessica's anger was immediate and protective. This is elder abuse, David. She took advantage of a grieving man who's been showing signs of confusion lately. There has to be some legal recourse. But even as she spoke, I could see the same realization dawning on her face that had been growing in my mind during the drive home. Sarah was too smart, too calculating, to have left obvious evidence of manipulation. Whatever she had done to convince Dad had probably been subtle, gradual, and carefully designed to look like his own decision. The next morning, I called Tom Harrison, the lawyer who had handled Dad's will and various business matters over the years. Tom had known our family for over a decade, and I hoped he might have some insight into what had really happened. David, I'm so sorry for your loss, Tom said when I reached him at his downtown office. Emily was such a sweet child. I can't imagine what you and Jessica are going through. After I explained the situation with the ownership transfer, there was a long pause before Tom spoke again. I have to tell you, David, that your sister contacted me about this several weeks ago. She expressed concerns about your father's mental state and his ability to make sound business decisions. My stomach dropped as Tom continued. She presented documentation suggesting that Robert had been making some questionable financial choices lately, and she argued that the business needed more stable leadership during this difficult time. She also mentioned that you had been understandably distracted by Emily's condition and might not be in the best position to take on additional responsibilities. The picture Sarah had painted was carefully crafted to make her takeover seem like a responsible intervention rather than a calculated theft. Tom's voice became more careful as he explained the legal realities. The transfer documents are properly executed and notarized. Your father appeared to be of sound mind when he signed them, and he clearly stated that this was his decision. Without clear evidence of coercion or mental incapacity, it would be very difficult to challenge the transfer in court. Even if you could prove that Sarah influenced his decision, that's not necessarily illegal if he retained the capacity to make his own choices. After hanging up with Tom, I sat in my home office surrounded by 16 years of Miller construction memories, photos from groundbreaking ceremonies, awards for safety excellence, thank you letters from satisfied clients, and blueprints for buildings that now dotted Austin's landscape. Each piece of paper represented hours of work, relationships built through trust and competence, and a legacy that I had assumed would someday pass to Emily or her future siblings. Now it all belonged to someone who had never swung a hammer, never stayed up all night troubleshooting a foundation problem, never felt the satisfaction of watching a building rise from an empty lot through careful planning and skilled execution. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I had been fighting to save my daughter's life, my sister had been systematically destroying everything else I cared about. Emily's medical bills had consumed our savings and forced me to take extended time away from the business, creating the perfect opportunity for Sarah to position herself as the more reliable family member. She had probably been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment when I would be too emotionally devastated to mount an effective defense. That afternoon, I drove to the Miller Construction headquarters in East Austin for the first time since Emily's funeral. The familiar sight of our equipment yard and office building should have been comforting, but instead it felt like visiting a crime scene. I parked next to the trailer that served as our main office and sat for a moment watching the normal activity of a Thursday afternoon in March. Trucks were coming and going, crews were loading materials for tomorrow's jobs, and everything looked exactly as it should. But I knew that behind the facade of normalcy, the foundation of everything I had worked for had been systematically undermined. Rachel Torres spotted me through the office window and came out immediately, her face a mixture of relief and concern. David, thank God you're here. I've been trying to reach you, but I didn't want to bother you so soon after the funeral. Rachel had been my right hand for 8 years, starting as a receptionist and working her way up to assistant manager through competence and loyalty. If anyone understood the real value of what I brought to Miller Construction, it would be Rachel. Something's wrong, David, Rachel said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. Sarah showed up yesterday with papers saying she's the new majority owner, and she's been making changes. She's called meetings with department heads, she's reviewing all our contracts, and she's asking questions about things she doesn't understand. The crew chiefs are confused, because they've never worked with her before, and some of the clients are starting to ask questions about where you are. As Rachel talked, I could see the concern in her eyes deepening. David, she doesn't know how this business really works. Yesterday she asked me why we couldn't just use cheaper materials on the Morrison project to increase profit margins. When I explained that we have quality standards and the client specifically requested premium materials, she said we needed to be more creative about cost cutting. She's treating this like some kind of generic corporate restructuring, instead of understanding that our reputation is built on delivering exactly what we promise. The full scope of the disaster began to crystallize as Rachel continued her report. She's also been asking about employee contracts and talking about efficiency improvements. I think she's planning to cut staff, David. She doesn't understand that our crews have been together for years, that they know each other's strengths and work together like a machine. She sees labor costs on a spreadsheet, but she doesn't see the relationships and expertise that actually get buildings built on time and under budget. I felt a surge of protectiveness for the employees who had trusted me with their livelihoods for years. These weren't just numbers on a payroll. They were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work, family men who depended on steady employment, and professionals who had helped build Miller Construction's reputation for excellence. The thought of Sarah treating them as disposable expenses while she pursued some theoretical efficiency model made my blood boil. "Where is she now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building inside me. Rachel nodded toward the main office. "She's in your father's office, going through files with some consultant she hired. David, I don't think she even realizes how much you do here. She asked me yesterday who handles client relationships and project oversight, like she thought those were separate job functions. When I told her you personally manage our major accounts and oversee multiple projects simultaneously, she looked at me like I was making it up." As I walked toward the office building, I could see through the windows that Sarah had indeed made herself at home in Dad's space. She was sitting behind his desk, dressed in a business suit that seemed ridiculously formal for a construction company office, pointing at documents while speaking to a young man in an equally inappropriate outfit. The sight of her treating Dad's sanctuary like her personal corporate headquarters was infuriating, but it also revealed something important about her fundamental misunderstanding of what Miller Construction really was. I pushed open the office door without knocking, and Sarah looked up with an expression that managed to combine surprise, annoyance, and what might have been a flicker of guilt. "David, I didn't expect to see you back so soon. How are you holding up?" Her tone was perfectly calibrated to sound concerned, while maintaining an underlying note of authority, as if my presence in my own workplace was something she needed to approve. "I'm holding up fine, Sarah. The question is, what exactly do you think you're doing here?" I gestured around the office that I had helped design and organize over the years, every detail reflecting the practical needs of managing construction projects. Sarah had already begun rearranging things, adding corporate-looking binders, and replacing Dad's familiar chaos with sterile organizational systems that probably looked impressive to her consultant, but would make finding anything impossible for people who actually worked there. Sarah stood up, straightening her jacket in a gesture that I recognized from our childhood as her way of preparing for confrontation. "I'm doing what needs to be done to protect this company's future, David. Dad made me majority owner because he recognizes that Miller Construction needs professional management to survive in today's competitive market. I know this is difficult for you to accept, especially right now, but I'm trying to build something bigger than what we've had before." The corporate speak flowing from my sister's mouth was almost surreal in the context of our family business. This was the same person who used to help me build forts in Dad's scrap lumber pile, who had once spent an entire summer learning to operate a small excavator just because she was bored. Now she was talking about competitive markets and professional management, as if the previous 38 years of Miller Construction's success had been some kind of accident. "Sarah, you've been back in Austin for 8 months, and before that you hadn't shown any interest in this business for over a decade. What makes you think you understand how to run a construction company better than someone who's been doing it successfully for 16 years? I tried to keep my voice calm, but the absurdity of the situation was making diplomacy increasingly difficult. Sarah's consultant, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, looked up from his laptop with the kind of confidence that only comes from having never been responsible for anything more complex than a PowerPoint presentation. "Miller, I've been reviewing your company's financial records, and there are definitely opportunities for optimization. Your current operational model is quite traditional, and there are proven strategies for increasing efficiency and profitability in the construction sector." I stared at this kid who was probably still paying off student loans for his MBA, and wondered what kind of world we were living in, where theoretical knowledge was considered more valuable than decades of hands-on experience. "Son, what construction projects have you personally managed? What buildings have you seen rise from foundation to completion? What crews have you led through complex problem solving when the unexpected happens on a job site?" The consultant's confident expression flickered slightly, but Sarah stepped in before he could respond. "David, this isn't about construction experience. This is about business strategy, financial management, and market positioning. You're excellent at the operational side, but running a modern company requires skills that go beyond knowing how to pour concrete and frame walls." Her words revealed the depth of her misunderstanding so clearly that I almost laughed. "Sarah, do you know how many different skills it takes to successfully manage a construction project? I have to understand engineering, budgeting, scheduling, materials science, safety regulations, building codes, labor law, client relations, subcontractor management, equipment maintenance, weather contingency planning, and about 50 other things that your consultant's business school probably covered in a single elective course. I walked over to Dad's desk, where Sarah had spread out various financial documents and strategic planning materials. You see this contract here for the Henderson Plaza project. I picked up a thick folder that represented months of work. This isn't just about construction. I had to understand the client's business model, analyze foot traffic patterns, coordinate with city planners, negotiate with multiple subcontractors, manage supply chain logistics during a material shortage, and solve 17 different engineering challenges that came up during construction. The profit margin on this project isn't just a number on your spreadsheet. It's the result of hundreds of decisions that required both technical knowledge and business judgment. Sarah's face was reddening, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. David, you're being emotional and defensive. I'm not saying your work isn't valuable, but this company needs strategic leadership to grow beyond what it's been. Dad agrees with me, which is why he made the ownership transfer. You can continue to handle the day-to-day operations while I focus on the bigger picture. The casual dismissal of my role as day-to-day operations while she handled the bigger picture was the final straw. Sarah, the day-to-day operations are the business. There is no bigger picture without the foundation of competent project management, client relationships, and quality workmanship. You can't optimize what you don't understand, and you clearly don't understand the first thing about how
This company actually functions. As I spoke, I could see doubt creeping into the consultant's expression, and I realized that Sarah's confident presentation of her takeover plans might not be going as smoothly as she had expected. The reality of running a construction company was undoubtedly more complex than whatever theoretical models they had been discussing, and the gap between their PowerPoint presentations and actual operational requirements was probably becoming obvious. But I also knew that pointing out the flaws in Sarah's understanding wouldn't be enough to solve the fundamental problem. She now owned 65% of Miller Construction, and unless I could find a way to prove that the ownership transfer had been invalid, I was trapped in the position of being a minority partner in the business I had built. The next few weeks would determine whether Miller Construction survived Sarah's well-intentioned incompetence, and whether I would be able to protect the employees and clients who had trusted me with their livelihoods and dreams. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me after weeks of grief-induced fog. The shock of Sarah's betrayal had somehow cut through the numbness that had enveloped me since Emily's death, replacing it with a focused determination I hadn't felt in months. Jessica was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a stack of papers beside her coffee cup. She looked up when I entered, and I could see that she had been crying, but there was something fierce in her expression that I recognized from the early days of Emily's illness when we had refused to accept the initial prognosis. "I've been thinking about this all night," Jessica said without preamble. "Sarah may think she's clever, but she's made some assumptions that might not be as solid as she believes. I spent the last few hours researching Texas business law and elder care regulations, and there are some things we need to investigate." She gestured to the papers spread across the table, which I could see were printouts of legal documents and medical information. "David, your father has been showing signs of cognitive decline for months. Remember how he got confused about that Henderson Plaza timeline last fall, and the way he's been repeating stories more frequently lately?" As Jessica spoke, memories began crystallizing in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. There had been small incidents over the past year that I had attributed to stress or normal aging, but when viewed together, they painted a more concerning picture. Dad forgetting meetings he had scheduled personally, becoming confused about project details he knew intimately, asking the same questions multiple times during conversations. I had been so focused on Emily's treatment that I hadn't paid proper attention to the subtle changes in his behavior, but Sarah certainly would have noticed them during her frequent visits to his ranch. "If we can establish that your father wasn't fully competent when he signed those ownership transfer documents, we might have grounds to challenge them legally," Jessica continued, her voice gaining strength as she outlined her research. "But we need medical documentation, witness testimony, and evidence that Sarah took advantage of his condition. This isn't going to be easy, and it's going to require us to publicly question your father's mental capacity, which I know is painful to consider." The idea of having Dad examined by doctors and potentially declared incompetent felt like another betrayal, but I knew Jessica was right about the necessity of exploring our options. "What kind of evidence would we need?" I asked, sitting down beside her and looking at the legal documents she had printed. The language was dense and intimidating, full of terms like testamentary capacity and undue influence that seemed designed to discourage ordinary people from challenging powerful interests. Jessica had clearly been thorough in her research. We need to establish a pattern of cognitive decline that was evident before the ownership transfer. Medical records would be ideal, but witness testimony from people who interacted with him regularly could also be valuable. We need to show that Sarah had opportunity and motive to manipulate him, and we need to demonstrate that the transfer was inconsistent with his previously expressed intentions about the business. The more we discussed the legal possibilities, the more I realized how carefully Sarah had positioned herself for this takeover. Her frequent visits to Dad's house, her offers to help with his personal affairs, her gradual assumption of responsibilities that he had always handled himself, all of it created a pattern that looked like loving daughter caring for an aging father rather than predatory behavior. She had been smart enough to make her influence appear benevolent while systematically isolating Dad from other perspectives about the business. After Jessica left for work, I called Rachel at the office to get a clearer picture of what was happening at Miller Construction under Sarah's new management. Rachel's voice was tense when she answered, and I could hear unusual commotion in the background. "David, I'm so glad you called. Things are getting chaotic here. Sarah fired Jim Kowalski this morning." Jim was one of our most experienced crew chiefs, a man who had been with the company for 12 years and knew our processes better than almost anyone. She said his salary was too high for his productivity level, but she doesn't understand that Jim's value isn't just in his individual output. He trains new workers, troubleshoots complex problems, and maintains relationships with our key subcontractors. The news about Jim hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just an employee, he was part of the family culture that made Miller Construction special. His expertise had saved us from costly mistakes on dozens of projects, and his mentorship had developed several younger workers into skilled craftsmen. More importantly, firing him sent a message to the rest of the crew that their loyalty and experience meant nothing to the new management. What was Sarah's justification? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. She showed me a spreadsheet comparing hourly wages to individual task completion times, Rachel said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. She doesn't understand that construction work isn't a factory assembly line where you can measure productivity by counting widgets. Jim spends time solving problems before they become expensive disasters. He spends time teaching younger workers so they don't make mistakes that could hurt someone or damage equipment. Those things don't show up on her efficiency metrics, but they're essential to how we operate. As Rachel continued describing Sarah's changes, a picture emerged of someone trying to apply generic business principles to a specialized industry she didn't understand. She had questioned why we maintained relationships with certain suppliers who weren't always the cheapest option, not recognizing that reliable delivery schedules and quality consistency were worth paying premium prices. She had suggested combining certain job functions to eliminate redundancy, not understanding that our safety protocols and quality control measures required multiple people to verify critical decisions. "The worst part is that she's not listening to feedback," Rachel said. "When I tried to explain why certain procedures exist, she said she appreciated my input but that fresh perspective was needed to modernize the company. She's treating decades of accumulated wisdom like outdated thinking that needs to be disrupted." The irony of a woman with no construction experience dismissing the expertise of people who had spent their careers mastering the complexities of the industry was almost too absurd to believe. That afternoon, I drove to one of our active job sites, the Morrison project that Rachel had mentioned during our conversation. It was a small office building in South Austin, the kind of straightforward construction that Miller Construction could complete efficiently while maintaining our quality standards. As I parked near the temporary fence surrounding the site, I could immediately see that something was wrong. The usual rhythm of coordinated activity was missing, replaced by confusion and inefficient movement that suggested problems with leadership and communication. I found Tony Morales, one of our senior workers, struggling to coordinate a concrete pour that should have been routine. Tony had been with us for 8 years, working his way up from general laborer to a position of significant responsibility, and I had never seen him look so frustrated. "Mr. Miller, thank God you're here," he said when he spotted me. "We've got problems with this pour, and nobody seems to know who's making decisions anymore. Jim always handled the coordination with the concrete supplier, but they fired him yesterday, and Sarah sent some kid from her consulting company to oversee the job instead." The kid in question was standing near the concrete truck, holding a clipboard and looking completely overwhelmed by the complexity of managing a concrete pour in real time. Concrete work requires precise timing, careful coordination between multiple crews, and the ability to adapt quickly when unexpected problems arise. Weather conditions, traffic delays, equipment malfunctions, and a dozen other variables can affect the process, and experienced supervisors know how to adjust on the fly to maintain quality and safety standards. What's the specific problem? I asked Tony, though I could already see several issues developing. The concrete truck had been waiting too long, which meant the mix was starting to set up before it could be properly placed. The crew responsible for finishing the surface wasn't positioned correctly, and the equipment needed for proper consolidation hadn't been set up in the optimal locations. These weren't catastrophic errors yet, but they would become expensive problems if not corrected quickly. Tony gestured toward the young consultant who was frantically making phone calls while staring at his clipboard. He doesn't understand the timing requirements for this type of pour. He's been trying to follow some kind of checklist, but when the concrete truck showed up earlier than scheduled, he didn't know how to adjust the crew positioning. We tried to explain what needed to happen, but he said we should stick to the original timeline because that's what the schedule showed. I could see the concrete truck driver getting impatient, and I knew we had maybe 20 minutes before the mix became unusable, and we'd have to start over with fresh concrete, adding thousands of dollars to the project cost and potentially delaying the entire timeline. This was exactly the kind of situation where experience and judgment were irreplaceable, where theoretical knowledge had to be supplemented by practical understanding of how materials behave under real-world conditions. Without hesitation, I stepped in to coordinate the pour, drawing on 16 years of experience to quickly assess the situation and make the necessary adjustments. I repositioned the crews, modified the placement sequence to account for the early delivery, and communicated with the concrete supplier to ensure the mix specifications were appropriate for the revised timeline. Within minutes, the chaotic scene transformed into the coordinated dance of professionals who knew their roles and trusted their leadership. As we worked, I could see the relief on the faces of workers who had been struggling under incompetent supervision. These were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work, and they had been frustrated by the inability to perform at their usual level of excellence. The young consultant watched in apparent amazement as complex problems were solved through experience and communication rather than checklists and procedures. When the pour was completed successfully, Tony pulled me aside with an expression of gratitude mixed with concern. "Mr. Miller, we need you back here permanently. This consultant doesn't understand the first thing about actual construction work, and Sarah keeps sending more of them to oversee different aspects of the job. The guys are talking about looking for work elsewhere if things don't improve soon." The thought of losing experienced workers because of Sarah's mismanagement was infuriating, but it also highlighted a crucial vulnerability in her takeover plan. Miller Construction's success wasn't just built on contracts and equipment, it was built on relationships, expertise, and reputation. If skilled workers left for other companies, if clients became dissatisfied with declining quality, if subcontractors lost confidence in our management, the business would collapse regardless of who owned it on paper. That evening, I met with Tom Harrison again to discuss our legal options more thoroughly. Tom's office in downtown Austin felt like a refuge from the chaos that was engulfing my professional life, and his calm, methodical approach to complex problems was exactly what I needed. "David, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to explore some additional possibilities," Tom said as we settled into the leather chairs in his conference room. "The ownership transfer documents are legally valid as written, but there are several ways we might be able to challenge them if we can establish the right foundation," Tom continued, spreading out copies of the relevant paperwork. "The most promising approach would be to demonstrate that your father lacked the mental capacity to understand the implications of what he was signing, or that Sarah exercised undue influence over his decision-making process." Tom explained that proving diminished capacity would require medical evaluation and possibly testimony from experts in geriatric psychiatry, but there were other approaches that might be easier to pursue. "If we can show that the transfer was inconsistent with your father's previously expressed intentions, or that Sarah misrepresented important facts about the business or your role in it, we might have grounds for a claim of fraud or undue influence." As Tom outlined the legal possibilities, I began to understand that challenging Sarah's takeover would require a comprehensive strategy that went beyond simply disputing the ownership transfer. We would need to document the damage her mismanagement was causing to the business, gather evidence of her incompetence and misrepresentation, and build a case that she had obtained control through deception rather than legitimate business judgment. There's another angle we should consider, Tom said, leaning forward with the expression he got when he was developing a particularly clever legal strategy. Sarah may own 65% of the company, but that doesn't give her unlimited power to make decisions that damage the business or violate her fiduciary duties to minority shareholders. If we can document that her management decisions are destroying the company's value, we might be able to seek legal remedies even without challenging the ownership transfer directly. The idea of holding Sarah accountable for mismanagement as a fiduciary duty issue was intriguing, especially given the mounting evidence of her incompetence. What kind of documentation would we need for that approach? I asked, thinking about the reports I was already receiving from Rachel about declining morale, employee departures, and client concerns. Tom smiled with the satisfaction of a lawyer who had found a promising angle of attack. We need to establish that she's making decisions that no reasonable business person would make under similar circumstances. Firing experienced employees without cause, ignoring industry best practices, refusing to listen to expert advice from people with relevant experience. If we can show a pattern of behavior that's damaging the business, we can argue that she's breaching her fiduciary duty to protect the company's value. Over the next week, I began systematically documenting the chaos that Sarah's management was creating at Miller Construction. I interviewed workers who had been fired or marginalized, collected reports from Rachel about declining efficiency and rising costs, and spoke with clients who were expressing concerns about changes in project management. The picture that emerged was of a company in rapid decline under leadership that prioritized theoretical efficiency over practical competence. The Henderson Plaza project, which had been proceeding smoothly under my supervision, was now experiencing delays and cost overruns that threatened our relationship with one of our most important clients. Sarah had replaced the experienced project manager with one of her consultants, who had immediately begun implementing changes that disrupted established workflows and communication channels. Subcontractors were confused about who was making decisions, workers were uncertain about their responsibilities, and the client was becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of clear leadership. When I reviewed the financial impact of just 1 week of Sarah's management, the numbers were staggering. The Morrison project had incurred additional costs of $15,000 due to the concrete pour problems and subsequent delays. 3 experienced workers had given notice, creating knowledge gaps that would be expensive to fill. 2 clients had expressed concerns about project management that could jeopardize future contracts worth over $500,000. But perhaps most damaging was the erosion of Miller Construction's reputation for reliability and quality. Word travels fast in Austin's construction community, and stories about the chaos at Miller job sites were already spreading among contractors, suppliers, and potential clients. Sarah's academic approach to business optimization was creating exactly the kind of operational problems that had kept our competitors from achieving our level of success. As I compiled evidence of Sarah's mismanagement, I also began reaching out to Dad's friends and neighbors to gather information about his mental state during the months leading up to the ownership transfer. What I discovered was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Several people mentioned concerns about his memory and judgment, incidents where he had seemed confused about familiar topics or unable to follow complex conversations. Mrs. Patterson, who lived on the neighboring ranch, told me about a conversation she'd had with Dad just 2 weeks before Emily's funeral. "He seemed lost, David," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "He kept asking me the same questions about my grandson's graduation, like he couldn't remember that we'd already talked about it. And when I mentioned something about Miller Construction, he looked confused and said he wasn't sure what was happening with the business anymore." Dr. Rodriguez, Dad's longtime physician, was more circumspect when I contacted him, but he confirmed that there had been discussions about cognitive changes during recent appointments. "I can't share specific medical information without your father's consent," he said carefully, "but I can tell you that age-related cognitive decline is a common concern for people in their late 60s, especially those who have experienced significant stress or loss." Armed with growing evidence of both Dad's diminished capacity and Sarah's destructive management, I began to feel cautiously optimistic about our chances of mounting a successful legal challenge. But I also knew that the longer Sarah remained in control, the more damage she would do to the business that represented my life's work, and the livelihoods of dozens of families who depended on Miller Construction for their financial security. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Rachel called me in tears. "David, you need to get down here right away. Sarah just fired 3 more people, including Maria Santos." Maria was our office manager, a dedicated professional who had been with the company for 10 years and knew every aspect of our administrative operations. She said Maria was resistant to change and that we needed people who could adapt to new business models. When I arrived at the office, I found Maria cleaning out her desk while several other employees watched in shocked silence. Maria had been the backbone of our administrative operations, the person who maintained relationships with clients, coordinated schedules, and ensured that paperwork was completed accurately and on time. Losing her would be like removing the nervous system from a living organism, creating chaos that would ripple through every aspect of the business. "Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry this is happening," Maria said as she packed her personal belongings into a cardboard box. "I tried to explain to your sister how our client management system works, but she said it was too complicated and that we needed to streamline our processes. She wants to replace our personal service approach with some kind of automated system that treats clients like account numbers instead of relationships." The systematic destruction of everything that made Miller Construction special was almost too painful to watch. Sarah was dismantling 38 years of carefully built culture, relationships, and expertise in pursuit of theoretical efficiencies that existed only in business school case studies. She was turning a respected family business into a generic corporate entity that had no understanding of what made construction companies successful. That weekend, Jessica and I made the difficult decision to move forward with legal action to challenge Sarah's control of the company. We knew it would be expensive, emotionally draining, and potentially divisive within our family, but we also knew that allowing her mismanagement to continue would destroy everything Dad and I had built together. The business that had supported our family for nearly 4 decades, that had provided good jobs for dozens of workers, that had contributed to Austin's growth and development, deserved better than to be sacrificed on the altar of Sarah's corporate ambitions. As I prepared for what I knew would be a long and difficult fight, I drew strength from the knowledge that I was fighting not just for my own interests, but for the principles that had made Miller Construction successful. Quality craftsmanship, personal relationships, respect for expertise, and commitment to excellence weren't just business strategies. They were values that created meaning and purpose in work. Sarah's attempt to replace those values with generic efficiency metrics represented everything wrong with modern corporate culture, and I was determined to prove that some things were more important than maximizing short-term profits. The battle for Miller Construction was about to begin, and I was ready to fight for everything I believed in. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp March air that usually energized me for a productive week, but as I sat in my truck outside the Miller Construction office, I felt only a heavy sense of dread about what I might discover inside. Over the weekend, I had received 3 more calls from concerned employees, each describing increasingly erratic decisions from Sarah and her team of consultants. The most alarming was from Carlos Mendez, our lead electrician, who reported that Sarah had canceled our contract with Reliable Electric Supply without consulting anyone who understood our operational needs. Reliable Electric had been our primary supplier for electrical components for over a decade, and while they weren't always the cheapest option, they provided guaranteed availability, technical support, and credit terms that helped us manage cash flow on large projects. Carlos explained that Sarah had found a supplier in Dallas, who promised 20% savings on materials, but she had failed to consider delivery schedules, quality standards, or the technical support that Reliable provided when complex electrical issues arose on job sites. "Mr. Miller, this new supplier doesn't even stock the specialized components we use for commercial projects," Carlos had told me during our phone conversation. When I tried to explain why we need certain specifications for the Henderson Plaza electrical system, Sarah's consultant told me that all electrical wire is basically the same, and that I was being inflexible about vendor relationships. "These people don't understand that cutting corners on electrical components can create safety hazards that could shut down an entire project." As I walked into the office building, I could immediately sense the tension that had replaced the usual collegial atmosphere of Miller Construction. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms, and I could see worry etched on the faces of employees who had once approached their work with confidence and enthusiasm. The systematic destruction of our company culture was proceeding exactly as Jessica had predicted, but witnessing it firsthand was more painful than I had anticipated. Rachel met me at the entrance with a thick folder of documents and an expression that mixed relief with barely controlled frustration. "David, I've been documenting everything like you asked, and the situation is worse than we discussed last week. Sarah held an all-hands meeting Friday afternoon, where she announced a complete restructuring of our operational procedures. She's implementing something she calls lean construction methodologies that eliminates what she considers redundant quality control measures. The folder Rachel handed me contained printouts of emails, meeting notes, and revised procedures that revealed the scope of Sarah's plans for Miller Construction. She had hired a consulting firm called Strategic Solutions Group to conduct what they termed an operational efficiency audit, and their recommendations read like a textbook example of how to destroy a successful business through misguided optimization efforts. "Look at this," Rachel said, pointing to a document titled Streamlined Quality Assurance Protocol. The new procedures eliminated multiple inspection points that we had developed over years of experience, consolidated supervisory roles that required different areas of expertise, and replaced our careful material selection process with automated purchasing based solely on cost considerations. She doesn't understand that our quality control measures aren't bureaucratic obstacles. They're the foundation of our reputation for excellence. As I reviewed the consulting firm's recommendations, I began to understand the full scope of Sarah's misunderstanding about how construction companies operate successfully. The consultants had analyzed our operations as if we were a manufacturing facility, producing identical widgets, rather than a service business that created unique solutions for complex building challenges. Their recommendations prioritized measurable efficiency metrics over the relationship-based, expertise-driven approach that had made Miller Construction successful. "There's more," Rachel continued, flipping to another section of the folder. "She's planning to eliminate our apprenticeship program because she says it's an inefficient use of senior workers' time. She wants to hire temporary laborers for simple tasks instead of training people to become skilled craftsmen. She doesn't realize that our apprenticeship program is how we maintain our quality standards and build loyalty among our workforce." The apprenticeship program had been one of Dad's proudest achievements, a structured approach to developing skilled workers who understood Miller Construction's standards and values. Over the years, we had trained dozens of young people who had gone on to become valuable employees, and many had stayed with the company for their entire careers. The program created a pipeline of skilled workers who were committed to our quality standards and understood the complexities of commercial construction. "What did the crew chief say during the meeting?" I asked, knowing that experienced supervisors like Jim Kowalski would have understood the implications of these changes immediately. Rachel's expression darkened, and I realized I had touched on another source of frustration. "That's the problem, David. She didn't include any of the crew chiefs in the planning process. She said she wanted fresh perspectives uncontaminated by traditional thinking." When Tommy Rodriguez tried to explain why certain procedures exist, she cut him off and said that resistance to change was exactly the kind of attitude that was holding the company back. Tommy Rodriguez had been with Miller Construction for 14 years, working his way up from apprentice to crew chief through demonstrated competence and reliability. His expertise in concrete work had saved us from expensive mistakes on dozens of
projects, and his ability to train younger workers was invaluable. The idea that his experience and judgment were considered obstacles to progress rather than valuable assets revealed the depth of Sarah's misunderstanding about what made our company successful. I spent the next hour reviewing financial reports that showed the immediate impact of Sarah's management decisions. The cost overruns from the Morrison project had escalated to $28,000 due to delays caused by supply chain disruptions and coordination problems. The Henderson Plaza project was now 3 weeks behind schedule because the replacement project manager couldn't maintain the complex coordination required for a multi-phase commercial building project. More concerning were the preliminary reports about client satisfaction that Rachel had compiled from her conversations with project contacts. The Brennan Development Group, which had been one of our most reliable clients for over 8 years, had expressed serious concerns about the changes in project management and was considering other contractors for future work. The Johnson Family Trust, which owned several commercial properties that we maintained, had asked direct questions about whether Miller Construction was still capable of providing the personalized service they expected. "David, we're losing clients," Rachel said bluntly. "Not just potential future contracts, but existing relationships that took years to build. These people chose Miller Construction because they trusted our expertise and valued our personal attention to their projects." Sarah's efficiency improvements are destroying exactly what made us attractive to quality clients who are willing to pay premium prices for superior service.
The irony of Sarah's situation was becoming clearer as I reviewed the mounting evidence of her mismanagement. She had assumed control of Miller Construction with the goal of increasing profitability through operational efficiency, but her changes were systematically destroying the competitive advantages that had made the company profitable in the first place. Her cost-cutting measures were generating expensive problems, her streamlined procedures were creating delays and quality issues, and her personnel decisions were driving away the expertise that clients valued. That afternoon, I drove to the Henderson Plaza job site to observe the impact of Sarah's management changes firsthand. The contrast with my previous visit was stark and troubling. Where I had once seen coordinated activity and purposeful movement, I now observed confusion, inefficiency, and the kind of tentative uncertainty that suggested workers were no longer confident in their leadership or procedures. The new project manager, a young man named Derek Walsh who had been hired by Strategic Solutions Group, was standing near the construction trailer with a tablet computer, apparently trying to coordinate activities through digital management tools rather than direct communication with workers. Derek had an MBA from a respected business school and experience in project management for technology companies, but he had never supervised construction work and clearly didn't understand the industry's unique requirements. I watched Derek struggle to address a problem with the building's structural steel installation, a complex issue that required understanding both engineering principles and practical construction techniques. The steel contractor was explaining that the specified beam connections wouldn't work with the actual field conditions, a common situation that experienced project managers handle by coordinating with engineers and fabricators to develop acceptable alternatives. Instead of facilitating problem-solving communication between the various specialists involved, Derek was consulting his tablet and trying to find procedural guidelines for handling design modifications. While he searched through digital files, the steel installation crew was standing idle, the crane operators accumulating expensive hourly charges, and the overall project timeline was being pushed further behind schedule. "Excuse me," I said, approaching Derek with what I hoped was a helpful rather than confrontational tone. "I'm David Miller, one of the company owners. It looks like you're dealing with a field modification issue. Would it be helpful if I connected you with our structural engineer? These kinds of problems usually require real-time collaboration between design and construction teams." Derek looked up from his tablet with an expression that mixed relief with professional defensiveness. "Mr. Miller, thank you for the offer, but I'm following the new protocols for handling design changes. According to the procedures manual, all modifications need to be documented and approved through the formal change order process before any work can proceed." The rigidity of his response revealed exactly why Sarah's systematized approach to construction management was creating problems rather than solving them. "Derek, I understand the importance of proper documentation, but construction projects often require immediate problem solving to avoid expensive delays," I explained, gesturing toward the idle crew and equipment. "We can handle the paperwork while we're developing solutions, but keeping skilled workers and expensive equipment waiting while we follow bureaucratic procedures is exactly the kind of inefficiency we should be avoiding." The conversation with Derek highlighted one of the fundamental problems with Sarah's approach to managing Miller Construction. She was trying to impose corporate bureaucracy on an industry that required flexibility, adaptability, and real-time decision-making. Construction projects involved too many variables and unexpected challenges to be managed effectively through standardized procedures and digital workflow systems. While Derek continued consulting his procedures manual, I took the initiative to call our structural engineer and coordinate a solution to the steel connection problem. Within 30 minutes, we had developed an acceptable alternative that met both engineering requirements and construction realities, and the installation crew was back to productive work. The resolution required exactly the kind of collaborative expertise and industry relationships that Sarah's efficiency protocols were designed to eliminate. As I watched the construction activity resume its normal rhythm, I realized that Sarah's management philosophy represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what made construction companies successful. She was treating building projects like abstract business problems that could be solved through process optimization and cost reduction, but construction work required deep technical knowledge, collaborative relationships, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. That evening, I met with Tom Harrison to discuss the legal strategy we were developing to challenge Sarah's control of Miller Construction. Tom had been conducting his own investigation into the circumstances surrounding the ownership transfer, and his findings supported our suspicions about Dad's diminished capacity and Sarah's manipulative behavior. "David, I've spoken with several people who interacted with your father during the weeks leading up to the ownership transfer, and there's a consistent pattern of confusion and memory problems. Tom said as we reviewed his notes. Dr. Rodriguez was helpful within the constraints of patient confidentiality, and he confirmed that your father has been experiencing age-related cognitive changes that could affect his decision-making ability. Tom explained that proving diminished capacity in court would require expert testimony from geriatric specialists, but the evidence we were gathering suggested that Dad's mental state during the ownership transfer was significantly different from his condition during previous important business decisions. The key is demonstrating that your father's cognitive decline was evident to Sarah, and that she took advantage of his vulnerability to obtain control of the company. More promising was the evidence we were developing about Sarah's misrepresentation of facts during the ownership transfer process. I've reviewed the documents that Sarah presented to your father, and they contain several misleading claims about the company's financial condition and future prospects, Tom continued. She presented selective information that made your role in the company appear less important than it actually was, and she made promises about business growth that were based on unrealistic assumptions. The legal strategy Tom outlined involved multiple approaches to challenging Sarah's control of Miller Construction. We would argue that the ownership transfer was invalid due to Dad's diminished capacity, that Sarah had exercised undue influence over his decision-making, and that she had obtained control through misrepresentation of material facts. Additionally, we would seek immediate legal relief to prevent further damage to the business while the ownership dispute was being resolved. There's another angle that might be even more effective, Tom said, leaning forward with the intensity he showed when developing particularly compelling legal arguments. We can petition the court for an emergency injunction to remove Sarah from operational control of the company based on her breach of fiduciary duty to minority shareholders. The evidence you've gathered about her mismanagement provides strong grounds for arguing that she's destroying the business value. The prospect of obtaining immediate relief through a fiduciary duty claim was encouraging, especially given the mounting evidence of Sarah's incompetence and the accelerating damage to Miller Construction's operations. What kind of timeline are we looking at for that approach? I asked, thinking about the employees who were losing their jobs and the clients who were losing confidence in our ability to serve their needs. Tom's expression became more cautious as he explained the procedural requirements for seeking emergency relief. We need to file comprehensive documentation of the damage Sarah's management is causing, along with expert testimony about industry standards and proper business practices. The court will want to see clear evidence that immediate intervention is necessary to prevent irreparable harm to the business. Over the next week, I worked with Rachel and several other employees to compile detailed documentation of Sarah's mismanagement and its impact on Miller Construction's operations. We gathered reports about cost overruns, schedule delays, employee departures, and client concerns that painted a comprehensive picture of a business in rapid decline under incompetent leadership. The most damaging evidence came from our analysis of the Henderson Plaza project, which had been proceeding smoothly under my supervision but was now experiencing serious problems under Derek Walsh's management. The project was now 5 weeks behind schedule, had incurred cost overruns of over $60,000, and was generating daily complaints from the client about communication problems and quality concerns. The client called me directly yesterday, Rachel reported during one of our documentation sessions. They wanted to know if Miller Construction was still capable of completing the project according to specifications. They're concerned about the changes in project management and the apparent lack of coordination between different trades. They're talking about bringing in another contractor to finish the work. The possibility of losing the Henderson Plaza contract was particularly troubling because it represented exactly the kind of client relationship that made Miller Construction valuable. Brennan Development Group had worked with us on multiple projects over the years, and they had specifically requested our involvement in Henderson Plaza because they trusted our expertise and reliability. Losing their confidence would damage our reputation throughout Austin's commercial development community. More evidence of Sarah's destructive impact came from our suppliers and subcontractors, who were reporting increasing problems with communication, payment processing, and coordination of work schedules. The electrical supply situation that Carlos had described was just one example of how Sarah's cost-cutting measures were creating operational problems that cost more money than they saved. Reliable Electric called me this morning, Carlos reported during our meeting. They wanted to know if we were having financial problems because we canceled our account so abruptly. When I explained that it was a management decision to find cheaper suppliers, they said they were surprised because we had always been one of their most valued clients. They offered to match any competitor's pricing if we wanted to maintain our relationship. The revelation that Reliable Electric had been willing to negotiate pricing made Sarah's decision to change suppliers even more questionable. She had damaged a valuable business relationship and created operational problems without even exploring whether our existing supplier could match the cost savings she was pursuing. Her approach prioritized confrontation over collaboration, burning bridges instead of building stronger partnerships. As we compiled evidence for our legal challenge, the pattern of Sarah's mismanagement became increasingly clear. She was making decisions based on theoretical business principles rather than practical understanding of construction industry requirements. Her changes were systematically destroying the competitive advantages that had made Miller Construction successful, replacing expertise with inexperience, relationships with transactions, and quality with false economy. The most heartbreaking aspect of documenting Sarah's impact was seeing how it affected the employees who had devoted years of their careers to building Miller Construction's reputation. These were skilled professionals who took pride in their work and had trusted me with their livelihoods, and Sarah's mismanagement was destroying both their economic security and their professional satisfaction. Mr. Miller, I've been here for 9 years, and I've never seen morale this low, said Patricia Williams, our administrative coordinator. People are scared about their jobs, confused about the new procedures, and frustrated by the lack of communication from management. We used to be proud to work for Miller Construction, but now we're embarrassed to tell clients that we're having management problems. The erosion of employee confidence was perhaps the most serious long-term threat to Miller Construction's viability. Skilled construction workers have many employment options in Austin's booming economy, and losing experienced employees would be far more damaging than any short-term cost savings Sarah might achieve through her efficiency measures. By the end of the week, Tom Harrison had assembled a comprehensive legal filing that detailed Sarah's breach of fiduciary duty and requested emergency intervention to protect Miller Construction from further damage. The document included expert testimony from construction industry professionals, financial analysis showing the cost of Sarah's mismanagement, and statements from employees and clients documenting the operational chaos her changes had created. David, this is one of the strongest cases for emergency relief I've seen, Tom said as we reviewed the final filing. The evidence of mismanagement is overwhelming, and the potential for irreparable harm to the business is clearly documented. If the court agrees to hear our petition, we have an excellent chance of getting Sarah removed from operational control while the ownership dispute is being resolved. As I prepared for what I knew would be a decisive legal battle, I drew strength from the knowledge that I was fighting not just for my own interests, but for the principles that had made Miller Construction a respected member of Austin's business community. The employees who depended on the company for their livelihoods, the clients who relied on our expertise for their projects, and the legacy that Dad had spent 38 years building all deserved better than to be sacrificed to Sarah's misguided corporate ambitions. The fight for Miller Construction was about to move from the job sites and office buildings to the courthouse, where legal arguments would determine whether experience and expertise could triumph over manipulation and misrepresentation. I was ready to present our case and prove that some things were more important than theoretical efficiency and short-term cost savings. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning in Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom, and as I sat in the austere waiting area outside her chambers, I felt the weight of 16 years of dedication to Miller Construction resting on the outcome of the next few hours. Tom Harrison was beside me, reviewing his notes one final time, while across the hallway Sarah sat with her own legal team, a group of expensive-looking attorneys from a downtown firm that specialized in corporate defense. She had traded her usual business attire for a more conservative outfit that projected competence and responsibility, but I could see the tension in her posture that suggested she wasn't as confident as she wanted to appear. The legal brief Tom had filed painted a devastating picture of systematic mismanagement that was destroying Miller Construction's value and threatening the livelihoods of 45 employees. We had documentation showing cost overruns exceeding $200,000 in just 6 weeks, the loss of 3 major clients, and the departure of 12 experienced workers who had taken their expertise to competitors. More importantly, we had testimony from industry experts who confirmed that Sarah's management decisions violated basic principles of construction business operations. Judge Coleman called the hearing to order precisely at 9 o'clock, and her reputation for no-nonsense efficiency was immediately evident in how she managed the proceedings. This is an emergency petition for injunctive relief based on allegations of breach of fiduciary duty and mismanagement of a closely held corporation, she announced, looking directly at both legal teams. I've reviewed the extensive documentation provided by both parties, and I'm prepared to hear arguments about whether immediate intervention is necessary to prevent irreparable harm to the business. Tom stood to present our case with the calm confidence that had made him one of Austin's most respected business litigators. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Miss Sarah Miller has systematically destroyed the operational foundations that made Miller Construction successful over nearly 4 decades. She has eliminated quality control procedures that protected the company's reputation, fired experienced employees whose expertise was irreplaceable, and made supplier decisions that prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term operational stability. As Tom outlined our arguments, I watched Sarah's attorneys taking notes and occasionally whispering among themselves. They had clearly prepared for this hearing, but I suspected they were struggling with the fundamental weakness of their position. How do you defend management decisions that are objectively destroying business value? How do you argue that firing experienced workers and alienating longtime clients represents sound business judgment? The financial impact of Ms. Miller's management decisions has been immediate and severe. Tom continued, referencing the detailed cost analysis we had prepared. The Henderson Plaza project alone has experienced cost overruns of $87,000 due to coordination problems and quality issues that didn't exist under Mr. David Miller's supervision. 3 major clients have expressed serious concerns about continuing their relationships with Miller Construction, representing potential lost revenue of over $1.2 million annually. Judge Coleman interrupted Tom's presentation to ask pointed questions about our documentation and the timeline of events. Her questions revealed that she had studied our filing carefully and understood the technical aspects of construction management that were central to our case. Harrison, your brief indicates that Miss Miller eliminated certain quality control procedures. Can you explain why those procedures are considered essential in the construction industry? Tom was ready for this question, and he called upon our expert witness, Dr. Margaret Thompson, a professor of construction management at the University of Texas who had analyzed Sarah's operational changes. Thompson explained that construction projects involve countless variables and potential failure points, making systematic quality control essential for preventing expensive problems. Ms. Miller's streamlined procedures eliminate multiple inspection points that serve as early warning systems for potential issues, Dr. Thompson testified. In construction work, identifying problems early can mean the difference between minor adjustments and major failures that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. When Sarah's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Blackwood, stood to present their defense, I could see that he was facing an uphill battle. Your Honor, Miss Miller is implementing legitimate business improvements designed to increase efficiency and profitability. The construction industry has traditionally been resistant to modern management techniques, and some of the opposition to Miss Miller's changes reflects this resistance rather than objective business concerns. Blackwood's argument relied heavily on theoretical business principles and generic management concepts, but he struggled to address the specific evidence of operational failures and financial losses. When Judge Coleman pressed him to explain why firing experienced employees and alienating longtime clients represented sound business strategy, his responses became increasingly abstract and unconvincing. Ms. Miller has extensive business education and corporate management experience, Blackwood argued. Her strategic vision for Miller Construction involves modernizing operations to compete more effectively in today's marketplace. The temporary disruptions being experienced are normal aspects of organizational change management. Judge Coleman's expression suggested she was not impressed by corporate jargon as a substitute for concrete business results. Mr. Blackwood, I'm looking at documentation showing that 3 experienced project managers have been replaced by consultants with no construction industry experience. Can you explain how that represents an improvement in management capability? Blackwood's answer revealed the fundamental weakness in Sarah's position. Your Honor, fresh perspectives unencumbered by traditional industry practices can identify opportunities for innovation and efficiency that experienced practitioners might overlook due to conventional thinking. The argument sounded absurd when applied to the practical realities of managing complex construction projects, and I could see that Judge Coleman was having difficulty taking it seriously. The most damaging moment for Sarah's case came when Judge Coleman asked her to testify directly about her management decisions. Sarah took the witness stand with apparent confidence, but her responses quickly revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about construction business operations. When asked to explain her decision to eliminate certain quality control procedures, she described them as redundant inspection protocols that slowed project completion without adding measurable value. Ms. Miller, can you describe your experience in construction project management prior to assuming control of Miller Construction? Judge Coleman asked, and Sarah's answer confirmed what we had argued in our brief. She had no direct experience managing construction projects, no understanding of industry-specific requirements, and no appreciation for the complexity of coordinating multiple skilled trades in challenging field conditions. Judge Coleman's questions became increasingly pointed as Sarah's testimony continued. Miss Miller, you fired Mr. Jim Kowalski, who had 12 years of experience as a crew chief. What was your reasoning for that decision? Sarah's answer about salary optimization and productivity metrics sounded hollow when contrasted with evidence about Jim's actual contributions to project success and worker development. The turning point came when Judge Coleman asked Sarah to explain the cost overruns and schedule delays that had occurred under her management. Sarah's response blamed the problems on worker resistance to change and client demands for outdated service levels, but her explanations contradicted the expert testimony we had presented about industry best practices and operational requirements. Miss Miller, I'm looking at testimony from Dr. Thompson indicating that your operational changes violate established construction industry standards. How do you respond to her assessment that eliminating multiple quality control measures increases the risk of expensive failures? Judge Coleman's question cut to the heart of our case, and Sarah's answer revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of risk management in construction work. Your Honor, I believe that excessive quality control measures reflect outdated thinking about efficiency and productivity. Sarah replied, apparently unaware that her answer was undermining her credibility with every word. Modern business practices emphasize streamlined operations and trust in worker competence rather than multiple inspection protocols. Judge Coleman's final questions focused on the financial impact of Sarah's management decisions and her plans for addressing the mounting problems at Miller Construction. Sarah's responses were evasive and unconvincing, relying on promises about future improvements rather than concrete solutions for immediate operational failures. After both sides had presented their arguments and evidence, Judge Coleman announced a brief recess to review the documentation and consider her decision. As we waited in the hallway outside her courtroom, I felt cautiously optimistic about our prospects. Sarah's testimony had been damaging to her own case, and her attorneys hadn't been able to provide convincing explanations for the operational chaos she had created. Tom was more direct in his assessment. David, I think we've presented a compelling case for emergency relief. Sarah's testimony was particularly helpful because it demonstrated her lack of understanding about construction industry requirements. Judge Coleman clearly understands the technical issues involved, and she seemed skeptical of the defense arguments. When court resumed 30 minutes later, Judge Coleman's decision was swift and decisive. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Ms. Sarah Miller's management of Miller Construction constitutes a breach of her fiduciary duty to minority shareholders and poses an immediate threat to the viability of the business. The documentation shows systematic mismanagement that has resulted in significant financial losses, operational disruption, and damage to client relationships. The relief I felt as Judge Coleman announced her decision was overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus on her specific orders. I am granting the plaintiff's petition for emergency injunctive relief and ordering that Ms. Sarah Miller be immediately removed from all operational control of Miller Construction. Mr. David Miller is hereby appointed as interim manager with full authority to make operational decisions, pending resolution of the underlying ownership dispute. Judge Coleman's order included specific provisions designed to protect the business while the ownership question was being resolved through separate litigation. Sarah was prohibited from making any personnel, operational, or financial decisions affecting Miller Construction, and she was required to cooperate with the transition of management responsibilities back to me. The immediate impact of the court order was evident as soon as we returned to the Miller Construction office. Rachel had been monitoring the hearing through legal updates, and she had already begun
notifying employees about the management change. The relief and excitement among the workers was palpable, and I could see hope returning to faces that had shown only worry and frustration for weeks. "David, thank God you're back in charge," said Tommy Rodriguez, our concrete specialist who had been particularly frustrated by Sarah's management changes. "We were starting to think we'd have to find new jobs just to keep doing quality work. These past few weeks have been like watching someone tear down everything we spent years building." My first priority was addressing the immediate operational problems that Sarah's mismanagement had created. The Henderson Plaza project required immediate attention to prevent further delays and cost overruns, and I spent the rest of Thursday coordinating with Derek Walsh's replacement and developing a recovery plan.
The electrical supply situation needed to be resolved quickly to avoid material shortages, and I called Reliable Electric to discuss restoring our business relationship. "David, we're delighted to hear that you're back in operational control," said Janet Morgan, our account representative at Reliable Electric. "We were concerned about Miller Construction when the relationship was terminated so abruptly, but we're happy to work with you on resuming service. We can match the pricing you were quoted by the Dallas supplier, and we can guarantee immediate availability for the specialized components you need." The restoration of our supplier relationships was easier than I had expected, largely because Miller Construction's reputation for reliability and prompt payment had created goodwill that survived Sarah's brief period of destructive management. Our subcontractors were similarly eager to resume normal working relationships, and several mentioned that they had been concerned about the company's future under Sarah's leadership. Over the following weeks, the process of rebuilding Miller Construction's operations revealed the full extent of damage that Sarah's mismanagement had caused. Beyond the immediate financial losses and operational disruptions, she had damaged relationships and eliminated institutional knowledge that would take months to fully restore. Several experienced employees who had been fired or had quit in frustration were willing to return, but others had found positions with competitors and were no longer available. The most significant challenge was rebuilding client confidence in Miller Construction's ability to deliver the quality and reliability that had made us successful. The Brennan Development Group agreed to continue with the Henderson Plaza project after I personally guaranteed that the remaining work would meet their standards, but they made it clear that future contracts would depend on demonstrated performance under restored leadership. "David, we've worked with Miller Construction for 8 years because we trusted your expertise and professionalism," said Mark Brennan during our meeting to discuss the project recovery plan. "The past few weeks raised serious questions about whether that level of service was still available. We're willing to give you the opportunity to prove that the problems were temporary, but our future relationship depends on seeing the quality and communication standards we've come to expect." The process of documenting the financial impact of Sarah's mismanagement for our ongoing legal case revealed losses that exceeded our initial estimates. When we included lost opportunities, damaged relationships, and the cost of rebuilding operations, the total impact approached $500,000 in just 6 weeks of incompetent leadership. The speed and scope of the damage demonstrated how quickly poor management decisions could destroy value that had taken years to create. Meanwhile, our legal challenge to the ownership transfer was proceeding through the court system with growing evidence that Dad's cognitive decline had been more severe than anyone had realized. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to provide medical testimony about Dad's condition during the months leading up to the ownership transfer, and his assessment supported our argument that Dad lacked the mental capacity to make such a significant business decision. "Your father's cognitive testing scores showed significant decline in executive function and decision-making ability," Dr. Rodriguez explained during his deposition. While he retained many social and conversational skills that might have made his condition less obvious in casual interactions, his ability to process complex information and understand long-term consequences was clearly impaired. More damaging to Sarah's position was evidence that she had been aware of Dad's cognitive problems and had deliberately taken advantage of his condition to obtain control of Miller Construction. Several witnesses testified that Sarah had made comments about Dad's memory problems and confusion, and her own emails contained references to his difficulty understanding business complexities that suggested she knew he wasn't capable of making informed decisions about the ownership transfer. The legal strategy Tom had developed was proving effective on multiple fronts. While the emergency injunction had restored operational control to me, the underlying ownership dispute was building toward a resolution that would likely invalidate Sarah's majority control. The combination of diminished capacity, undue influence, and misrepresentation created a compelling case for voiding the ownership transfer and restoring the previous ownership structure. 3 months after Judge Coleman's emergency order, the broader legal resolution came in the form of a settlement negotiation that avoided the need for a protracted trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence of Dad's cognitive decline and her own misrepresentation of facts, Sarah agreed to return her ownership share to the previous level and compensate Miller Construction for the damages caused by her mismanagement. The settlement included provisions for Dad's care and a structured transition plan that protected both his interests and the company's future stability. Sarah retained her original 5% ownership stake but was permanently barred from operational involvement in Miller Construction, and her compensation for returning control included an agreement not to pursue further claims against the company or family members. David, this settlement represents the best possible outcome for all parties involved, Tom explained as we reviewed the final agreement. Your father retains dignity and security, the company is protected from future interference, and you have clear authority to continue building Miller Construction's success. Sarah receives fair compensation for returning ownership she never should have obtained, and everyone can move forward without the uncertainty and expense of prolonged litigation. The resolution of the legal dispute allowed me to focus on rebuilding Miller Construction's operations and restoring the culture of excellence that had made us successful. The employees who had remained loyal during the crisis were rewarded with increased responsibilities and compensation, and we began implementing new policies designed to protect against future management disruptions while preserving the flexibility and expertise that were our competitive advantages. 6 months after regaining control of Miller Construction, the company was operating more successfully than ever before. The lessons learned during Sarah's brief reign of incompetence had actually strengthened our operational procedures and client relationships, and our reputation for quality and reliability had been enhanced by the way we had handled the management crisis. The Henderson Plaza project was completed on schedule and under budget, earning praise from the Brennan Development Group and leading to 3 additional contracts worth over $2 million. Our employee retention rate had improved significantly as workers appreciated the stability and professional respect that characterized our restored management approach, and our apprenticeship program was attracting the most talented young people we had seen in years. Perhaps most importantly, the experience had reinforced my understanding of what made Miller Construction special in Austin's competitive construction market. It wasn't just technical expertise or quality workmanship, though those were essential. It was the combination of deep industry knowledge, personal relationships, and institutional wisdom that could only be developed through years of dedicated involvement in the complexities of construction work. Dad's condition had stabilized under proper medical care, and while his cognitive decline couldn't be reversed, he was able to enjoy visiting job sites and sharing stories about the early days of Miller Construction. He seemed to understand that the company was thriving under my leadership, and there were moments when his pride in what we had built together shone through the confusion that had allowed Sarah to manipulate him. Sarah had used her settlement payment to start a consulting business focused on helping small companies implement efficiency improvements, though I occasionally heard reports that her lack of industry-specific knowledge continued to create problems for her clients. I felt no satisfaction in her struggles, but I was grateful that Miller Construction was protected from any future attempts to impose theoretical business solutions on practical operational challenges. As I reflected on the months of crisis and recovery, I realized that the experience had taught me valuable lessons about leadership, family dynamics, and the importance of protecting institutional knowledge. Sarah's attempt to optimize Miller Construction had failed not because she was malicious, but because she had fundamentally misunderstood what made the business successful. The construction industry requires a delicate balance of technical expertise, relationship management, risk assessment, and adaptability that can't be reduced to spreadsheet formulas or corporate efficiency metrics. Success comes from understanding that every project is unique, that quality and safety can't be compromised for short-term savings, and that the most valuable assets are often the relationships and expertise that don't appear on balance sheets. Miller Construction had survived its greatest crisis and emerged stronger because the principles that had made us successful were deeper than any individual personality or management philosophy. Quality craftsmanship, personal integrity, respect for expertise, and commitment to client satisfaction weren't just business strategies, they were values that created meaning and purpose in work. The company that Dad had founded nearly 4 decades ago was secure for the future, ready to continue serving Austin's development needs with the same dedication to excellence that had made Miller Construction a respected name in the construction community. And perhaps most importantly, Emily's memory was honored by the knowledge that the business her grandfather had built and her father had nurtured would continue creating opportunities for future generations of skilled craftsmen and satisfied clients. The Miller family legacy in construction was safe, built on foundations strong enough to withstand any challenge and flexible enough to adapt to whatever changes the future might bring. That was the real inheritance Dad had left me, not just ownership of a company, but stewardship of values and traditions that created value far beyond any financial measurement. 1 year after the legal dust had settled and Miller Construction had returned to its rightful operational rhythm, I found myself standing in the same cemetery where this entire ordeal had begun, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. It was Emily's birthday, and Jessica and I had come to place fresh flowers on her grave and share some of the good news that had emerged from the chaos that followed her funeral. The March air carried the same crispness as that devastating day 12 months earlier, but instead of the crushing weight of grief and betrayal, I felt a sense of completion and purpose that would have seemed impossible during those dark weeks. The settlement with Sarah had been finalized 6 months ago, and the transformation at Miller Construction had exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Not only had we recovered from the operational damage she had inflicted, but the company had actually grown stronger through the process of rebuilding and recommitment to our core values. The experience of nearly losing everything had clarified what truly mattered in both business and family relationships, and the lessons learned had created a foundation for sustainable success that was more solid than anything we had achieved before. Jessica knelt beside Emily's headstone, arranging the pink tulips that had been our daughter's favorite flowers, and I could see that while the grief remained present, it no longer dominated our emotional landscape the way it had during those first terrible months. She would have loved seeing Grandpa back at the job sites, Jessica said softly, referring to Dad's recent visits to Miller construction projects. His cognitive condition had stabilized with proper medical care and reduced stress, and while he couldn't handle complex business decisions anymore, he enjoyed spending time with the crews and sharing stories about the early days of the company. The most remarkable aspect of Dad's recovery was how much more lucid he became once the pressure of managing business decisions was removed from his shoulders. Rodriguez explained that cognitive decline often accelerates under stress, and the relief of knowing that Miller Construction was in competent hands had allowed Dad's remaining mental faculties to function more effectively. He was still living independently at his ranch house with part-time assistants, and our Sunday family dinners had become cherished opportunities to connect without the business tensions that had complicated our relationship during Sarah's brief period of control. I think Emily would also be proud of how we handled the situation with Sarah, I said, thinking about the approach we had ultimately taken toward rebuilding family relationships after the legal resolution. Rather than allowing the betrayal to create permanent divisions, Jessica and I had decided to focus on understanding and forgiveness while maintaining appropriate boundaries to protect Miller Construction's future. Sarah had been genuinely surprised by the extent of damage her management decisions had caused, and her initial defensiveness had gradually given way to something that resembled remorse, as the full consequences became clear. The conversation with Sarah that had finally cleared the air between us had taken place 3 months ago, during a family gathering at Dad's ranch that marked the first time we had all been together since the ownership transfer crisis. Sarah had approached me privately after dinner, and for the first time since childhood she seemed genuinely vulnerable and uncertain, rather than calculating and manipulative. "David, I need you to know that I never intended for things to go as badly as they did," she had said, her voice carrying a weight of regret that seemed authentic. I genuinely believed that my business education and corporate experience would help Miller Construction become more successful. That conversation had been both healing and frustrating, because it confirmed what I had suspected about Sarah's motivations while also highlighting the fundamental misunderstanding that had caused so much damage. She had acted from a combination of genuine concern for the family business and personal ambition, but her complete lack of industry knowledge had blinded her to the consequences of her decisions. "Sarah, the problem wasn't that you wanted to help," I had explained, trying to balance honesty with compassion. "The problem was that you assumed theoretical knowledge could replace practical experience without understanding what you were giving up in the process." The rebuilding of Miller Construction had required far more than simply reversing Sarah's operational changes. The months of uncertainty and poor management had damaged relationships with clients, suppliers, and employees that took sustained effort to restore. Some of the experienced workers who had left during Sarah's reign had found good positions elsewhere and weren't interested in returning, creating knowledge gaps that we addressed through expanded training programs and strategic hiring of seasoned professionals from other companies. The client relationship recovery had been particularly challenging because construction companies live or die based on reputation and trust. The Brennan Development Group had given us a second chance with the Henderson Plaza project, but several other longtime clients had decided to work with competitors rather than risk experiencing the kind of management chaos they had witnessed during Sarah's brief control. Rebuilding those relationships required not just excellent project performance, but also transparent communication about the changes we had made to prevent future management disruptions. Rachel Torres had been instrumental in the recovery process, and her loyalty during the crisis had earned her a promotion to operations manager with equity participation in the company's future success. Rachel, you held this place together when everything was falling apart, I had told her during the restructuring discussions. Miller Construction wouldn't exist today without your dedication and competence, and I want to make sure you're rewarded appropriately for that commitment. Her new role included responsibility for institutional knowledge preservation, ensuring that critical operational procedures and client relationships wouldn't be vulnerable to future management changes. The financial recovery had been faster than anyone expected, largely because the operational improvements we implemented during the rebuilding process had eliminated inefficiencies that had existed long before Sarah's destructive period. The crisis had forced us to examine every aspect of our operations with fresh eyes, and we discovered opportunities for genuine improvement that went far beyond the superficial cost-cutting measures Sarah had attempted to implement. The Henderson Plaza project had become a showcase for Miller Construction's renewed excellence, finishing ahead of schedule and under budget while exceeding all quality specifications. Mark Brennan had been so impressed with the project management and craftsmanship that he had recommended us for 3 additional projects worth over $3 million, and his endorsement had helped rebuild our reputation throughout Austin's development community. The difference between this project and what we experienced during the management transition is like night and day, Brennan had told me during the Henderson Plaza completion ceremony. This is the Miller Construction we remember working with, and it's exactly why we choose to pay premium prices for superior service. The quality communication and problem-solving ability you've demonstrated here proves that your company is back to operating at the highest level. The employee retention and morale improvements had been equally dramatic, with our workforce stability reaching levels we hadn't seen in years. The shared experience of surviving the management crisis had created stronger bonds among the workers who had remained loyal, and the transparent communication about company direction and decision-making had eliminated much of the uncertainty that had characterized the transition period. Tommy Rodriguez had summed up the employee perspective perfectly during our quarterly team meeting. Mr. Miller, we always knew you were a good boss, but going through this crisis made us realize how much difference good leadership actually makes. Having someone in charge who understands the work we do and respects our expertise makes every day better than it was before. The appreciation expressed by long-term employees had been one of the most rewarding aspects of the recovery process, confirming that the values and culture that made Miller Construction special were still intact and stronger than ever. The apprenticeship program that Sarah had threatened to eliminate had been expanded and enhanced, with new partnerships with local trade schools and community colleges that created pipelines for skilled workers who understood both traditional craftsmanship and modern construction technologies. The program had become a competitive advantage that helped us attract the most talented young people in the industry, and several other construction companies had asked to model their training programs after our approach. David, what you've built here with the apprenticeship program is exactly what the construction industry needs, said Dr. Margaret Thompson, the University of Texas professor who had testified on our behalf during the emergency hearing. You're proving that companies can be both profitable and socially responsible by investing in worker development and skill preservation. This is the kind of institutional knowledge transfer that ensures the industry continues to advance. The strategic planning process we had implemented following the crisis had created formal structures for succession planning and knowledge preservation that protected Miller Construction from future management disruptions while maintaining the flexibility and entrepreneurial spirit that had made us successful. The governance changes included advisory board participation from industry experts, client representatives, and senior employees who provided diverse perspectives on strategic decisions. Perhaps most importantly, the experience had taught me valuable lessons about balancing family relationships with business responsibilities. The ownership structure had been revised to include provisions for future transitions that protected both family interests and business continuity, with clear guidelines for management qualifications and decision-making authority that prevented the kind of manipulation that Sarah had been able to execute. Dad's role in the company had been formalized as founder emeritus, a position that honored his contributions while acknowledging his current limitations and ensuring that business decisions remained in competent hands. He continued to visit job sites regularly, sharing his knowledge and experience with younger workers who appreciated connecting with the company's history and traditions. The legal resolution had included provisions for Dad's long-term care that ensured his comfort and security, regardless of how his condition progressed, and the family relationships had stabilized around clear understanding of everyone's roles and responsibilities. Sarah had used her settlement funds to start a business consulting practice that focused on helping small service companies implement operational improvements. though she had learned to work exclusively with industries where she had relevant experience, rather than assuming universal applicability of business school theories. I've learned that every industry has unique requirements that can't be understood from the outside, Sarah had admitted during our most recent family gathering. My experience with Miller Construction taught me that expertise and relationships matter more than I realized, and I'm trying to apply those lessons to help other business owners who face real operational challenges. Her consulting practice was apparently successful within its more limited scope, and she seemed to have found professional satisfaction that didn't require competing with or controlling family members. The Miller Construction that had emerged from the crisis was stronger, more purposeful, and more resilient than the company that had entered it. The experience of nearly losing everything had clarified our values and priorities in ways that good times never could have achieved, and the relationships with employees, clients, and suppliers had been strengthened through the shared experience of rebuilding something worthwhile. As Jessica and I prepared to leave the cemetery after our visit to Emily's grave, I reflected on how much had changed since that devastating day, when Sarah's text message had added betrayal to the crushing weight of grief. The pain of losing Emily would never disappear completely, but it had been integrated into a life that was once again filled with purpose and meaning. Miller Construction was thriving, family relationships had been rebuilt on more honest foundations, and the future held promise rather than uncertainty. Do you think Emily would be proud of how everything turned out? Jessica asked as we walked back to our car, and I considered the question seriously before answering. Our daughter had inherited the Miller family's appreciation for quality workmanship and honest dealing, and she had always been fascinated by the process of building things that would last and serve useful purposes. I think she would be proud that we didn't give up when things looked impossible, I said finally. She would be proud that we fought for what was right without being cruel or vindictive, and she would be proud that Miller Construction is still helping to build Austin in ways that make the community stronger. The values that Emily had learned during her brief life were the same ones that had guided us through the crisis and recovery, and honoring her memory had been part of what motivated us to rebuild rather than simply survive. The drive home took us past several construction projects that Miller Construction had completed over the years, and I felt the satisfaction that comes from seeing tangible evidence of work that had created lasting value for the community. Buildings that housed businesses, provided homes for families, and served important community functions were monuments to the skill and dedication of the workers who had built them and the principles that had guided their construction. Miller Construction's story wasn't just about surviving a management crisis or resolving a family conflict, it was about preserving and protecting the institutional knowledge, relationships, and values that created meaning in work and contributed to community development. The company that Dad had founded nearly 4 decades ago was secure for the future, ready to continue serving Austin's construction needs with the same commitment to excellence that had made Miller Construction a respected name in the industry. The legacy we were building wasn't just financial or operational, it was cultural and relational. Every young person who learned skilled trades through our apprenticeship program, every client who received superior service and quality craftsmanship, every supplier or subcontractor who enjoyed honest and reliable business relationships, was part of a network of professional excellence that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single company. That evening, as I reviewed project plans for the week ahead and prepared for another day of building Austin's future, I felt grateful for the clarity that had emerged from crisis and the strength that had been forged through challenge. Miller Construction was more than a business, it was a vehicle for creating value, developing people, and contributing to community growth in ways that honored both tradition and innovation. The Miller family legacy in construction was secure, built on foundations strong enough to withstand any future challenges, and flexible enough to adapt to whatever changes the industry might bring. And perhaps most importantly, Emily's memory was honored by the knowledge that the principles she had learned during her brief life continued to guide decisions that created opportunities and value for countless other families. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.